When people imagine authoritarianism, they think of iron-fisted leaders, giant rallies, uniforms, marches, and crowds chanting one name. But the real rise of authoritarian power didn't begin in stadiums. It began in kitchens, at bank counters, in unemployment lines. Because before people surrender their freedom, they lose something far more intimate: economic security. Welcome to Finlore, where we uncover how power is purchased, not just imposed, and why history's darkest political experiments were financed long before they were feared. This is the story of how entire nations were convinced that dependence was stability, that order was worth more than liberty, and how the price of a job became the price of obedience. The collapse before the control. Authoritarianism never arrives when times are good. It arrives when the ground has already collapsed. In the early 20th century, Europe was living inside a storm of broken economies. The First World War had left nations drowning in debt, their currencies shredded by inflation, their industries shattered like bombed-out factories. But it wasn't just money that disappeared. It was direction. Millions of young men returned to countries that no longer had work for them, governments that no longer inspired them, and futures that no longer included them. When the global crash of 1929 hit, it wasn't just a market that fell. It was hope itself. Unemployment soared past 30%. Savings evaporated overnight. Middle-class families slid into poverty so fast they barely understood what happened. In the silence of that collapse, something changed. People stopped looking for ideology and started begging for stability. That is the moment authoritarianism waits for. Not when people are angry, but when they are desperate. The bargain that built a generation. Every authoritarian leader of the 20th century offered the same deal. Give up political uncertainty, I will give you economic certainty. It was a transaction disguised as patriotism. Leaders didn't take power because the masses demanded tyranny. They took power because the masses demanded relief. Relief from unemployment, relief from debt, relief from chaos. Authoritarian economics wasn't built on violence. It was built on payrolls. Governments became employers. Parties became providers. Loyalty became currency. If you wanted a job, you aligned with the state. If you wanted a loan, you joined the party. If you wanted safety, you obeyed. For millions of families who had lost everything, this wasn't oppression. It was salvation. And that is the dangerous genius behind the system. It doesn't feel like control. It feels like rescue. The engines of illusion. Authoritarian economies always follow the same blueprint. Spend big, borrow big, and hide the bill. Massive construction projects, huge public works, new industries, exploding job numbers. On paper, a miracle. In reality, a loan taken out against the future. Governments poured money into highways, dams, factories, national projects, and militarization. Unemployment dropped. Morale rose. Pride returned. But almost none of this growth was sustainable. The new jobs were often temporary. The new industries were propped up by the state. The statistics were adjusted to fit the story. And the debt was buried. Authoritarian regimes learned that you could fabricate prosperity long enough to win loyalty, even if you couldn't afford it. Because people don't check the national balance sheet, they check whether there's food on the table. And when that food depends on the state, so does their freedom. The economy of obedience. Every authoritarian regime eventually discovers the same truth. The easiest way to control a nation is to control its income. So they do. Independent unions? Dissolved. Strikes? Criminalized. Prices? Regulated. Wages? Set by the state. Industries? Private, but only in name. Your boss might sign your paycheck, but the government decides if the company survives. Soon, every economic decision becomes political. Who gets a job? Who gets a promotion? Who gets a contract? Who gets a loan? And one rule guides it all. Loyalty is more profitable than competence. This produces a society where people stop thinking like citizens and start thinking like employees. Employees who work for a boss they cannot criticize. It is compliance disguised as stability. And once a population adjusts to that trade, freedom becomes optional. Propaganda, the glue of control. Authoritarian economics isn't only about money, it is psychological. The state doesn't just provide jobs, it provides a story of national rebirth, a story of outsiders destroying the economy, a story of unity, destiny, sacrifice. People weren't told they were dependent, they were told they were patriotic. They weren't receiving state benefits, they were rebuilding the nation. Pride became a sedative. Entertainment became anesthesia. Symbolism became policy. When a nation believes its struggle is noble, it forgets to question the cost. That is when propaganda becomes more powerful than policing, because belief is cheaper than bullets. The moment the illusion breaks, debt can create the appearance of prosperity for a while. But illusions have an expiration date. As authoritarian governments spent more, controlled more, expanded more, the gap between propaganda and reality grew impossible to hide. Factories were producing, but not profitably. Jobs existed, but not independently. Budgets were balanced only on paper. National pride soared, but national finances collapsed. And when there is no more money to borrow, there is only one thing left to take: land, resources, nations, people. Expansion becomes the last stage of economic authoritarianism. War becomes an accounting strategy. It is the moment when the bill for fake stability arrives, and it is paid in human lives. The modern echo. We like to believe these lessons ended in the 20th century. They didn't. The tools simply changed their packaging. Today, governments stabilize economies with unprecedented debt. Central banks print money to buy time. States rescue failing industries to avoid unrest. Citizens rely on subsidies, benefits, state-backed careers, public contracts, and state-supported industries. People are more economically tied to their governments than at any time in modern history. You don't need a dictator to build dependence. You only need a system where survival is a policy decision. Ask yourself, when your mortgage depends on interest rates, your income depends on subsidies, your job depends on government funding, and your savings depend on inflation, how independent are you really? You don't need censorship when compliance is profitable. You don't need force
when comfort is addictive. You don't need a uniform when a paycheck works better. The psychology is the same. The design is the same. Only the branding changed. The lesson we keep trying to forget. Authoritarianism rarely announces itself. It doesn't begin with violence or with war. It begins with a promise. We will protect you. We will employ you. We will stabilize the chaos. And for a time, they do. Trains run. Jobs return. The news feels optimistic again. Until one day the system demands something more. Your silence, your belief, your obedience. Economic dependence becomes political dependence. Political dependence becomes cultural dependence. Eventually, questioning the system feels dangerous, and defending it feels natural. By then, the real cost is already paid, because no society loses its freedom suddenly. It trades it away slowly, installment by installment, paycheck by paycheck, and the final payment is always the same: the right to think independently. History doesn't repeat itself, but it whispers. It warns that any system that buys stability with debt, that buys unity with propaganda, that buys loyalty with jobs, eventually discovers that freedom is the only currency it cannot print. If this gave you a new way to see the past and the present, hit subscribe. History hides the truth in the fine print. I'll show you where to look.